Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of my own ancestry. On the left, you see an image of a ship that enslaved people were brought here to the wilderness of North America on. But you also see next to it a very important book that I would suggest that if you've never read it before, you take a moment and make a mental note and check out this book. It's by a man by the name of Ivan Van Sertima, and it's called The African Presence in Ancient America That Came Before Columbus. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about history being fashioned as mythology, all people who you consider to be of African descent or black didn't come here on one of those ships. Many of us did, but many of us were here prior to the transatlantic trade of enslaved people. Not the transatlantic slave trade, because these weren't slaves that came from the continent of Africa, these were people. So it's the transatlantic trade of enslaved people. That's a very important consideration when it comes to the value and the importance of language. So not all of us arrived here through those ships. Some of us arrived here through those ships, but some of us were already here. Also, some of us are actually indigenous to this land, right? That's also an often untold story about people who look just like me, that there's this misconception that we had to come from the continent of Africa, when in reality, many of us didn't come from anywhere. This is our indigenous land, right? Next slide. And then you also have a small percentage of us that actually came from the future, and we're here now striving to tell everybody about the things that you're doing and where it's gonna lead us into that future. But those who did go through that transatlantic trade of enslaved people, obviously they experienced what is known as slavery. And these are some images to kind of give you an idea of what that actually was. The one image that you see to the bottom right, it says slaves that sell, and it's a company that's actually selling people, right? So if you kind of put it in a modern day context, imagine going to Home Depot, right? And near the plants and everything else, you have the option to actually buy people. You know, just think about the ability for another human being to rationalize that, right? So now the first enslaved Africans landed here, and there's a debate whether it was 1555 or 1619. But if we go according to the date of 1619, the first ones who set foot here on America, they weren't subservient. People have always fought and resisted against slavery. And it's a large spectrum of that form of resistance. You had people who would raise up in armed rebellion and strive to overthrow plantations. You had people who would be willing to strive to poison enslavers or destroy crops, fake like they were sick or injured so that they didn't have to work. You know, a variety of various different acts which represents resistance. And then you also had those who would escape plantations. To the left is a very popular image of a man named Osmond the Maroon. Maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means rebel or unruly. And these were people who would escape plantations. It wasn't a part of the Underground Railroad, but these were people who escaped plantations and they went into areas that would be considered very difficult to live in, but it also provided them protection because of the vegetation. Over to the right is an area known as the Great Dismal Swamps, which covered a large area. And this was considered Maroon territory because if an enslaver lost one of the people on their plantation, they weren't willing to go into this area to retrieve them, right? This is also an area where guerrilla warfare actually took place. This is a part of some of my family who actually went to this area in the Great Dismal Swamps. And then you also have the Underground Railroad. Now, from poisoning enslavers to raising up an armed rebellion to escaping to the Great Dismal Swamps or other different areas, that would be considered maroon communities. The Underground Railroad is also one aspect of that resistance movement. Everything that you see in terms of those elements of a resistance movement ultimately represents the first human rights movement here in this country.